Now that Pompey had been defeated, food was no longer a problem. Yet, as experience had proven throughout the long existence of Rome, maintenance served as big a role as any hostile threat. Considering the numbers of men Lepidus was gathering over in Iberia, Octavian needed to expand his own army, a task that before-mentioned empire maintenance directly disrupted, at least if it was to have any meaningful impact in the war. What little leverage we had left in the budget was meant for the navy that needed to be replaced, desperately needed to be replaced actually. Octavian therefore went on to hire numerous governors to maintain the far reaches of the nation. However, the longer this process took, the stronger Lepidus would get. The Numidians lost their port to him, and if Octavian didn't act soon, all of Africa would be under the command of Lepidus again. Therefore, as soon as the fleet was at sufficient strength to safeguard our voyage, Octavian and Agrippa set sail, hoping Mark Antony wouldn't notice our absence before it was too late. Our invasion was swift and effective. Both armies landed just north of Carthage and, supported by the fleet, occupied the city. Agrippa then stayed behind while Octavian pushed for Thapsus, where Lepidus kept his own fleet docked. Even though taking the town itself was the goal, the real fight was at sea. Instead of facing us out in the open like most imbeciles would have done, they sailed to block our access to the port instead. A much wiser move that made our attack so much more difficult. Gliding through the waves that bashed into our hulls, we made contact with the enemy. Our ships were larger and could easily blast through our opposition's first line. However, their deeper ranks allowed them to immediately board our ships. A chain of wood and sweaty marines blocked our entry into the port for the majority of the battle. It was only by the sight of Octavian entering the town from land that made the enemy troops surrender. It might have been a decisive victory, but we were desperately in need of a stronger naval presence, or else our vast coastline would be vulnerable to attack if we can't even defeat a fleet with ships that tiny. I mean, our navy wasn't bad at all. It could still single-handedly conquer the 2 remaining ports of the African province. But if just one of all these armies over in Iberia were here in Africa, it would have been impossible. For the same reason, our army over in Terrico was on standby, waiting for Agrippa to arrive and launch another invasion into Iberia once he had forced his way through Africa. Our Gallic subjects, however, were on the warpath, not listening to our orders. I mean, let them be on their own then. On a positive note, land reclamation laws were approved, promising enhanced agricultural output. Without hesitation, we invested vast sums of gold into improving the livestock ranches for Latium, our main source of income and thus a worthwhile investment. Like we seized Africa, so did Mark Antony annex Thrace. Their former subjects were no match for the seasoned commander of the Gallic Wars. Time was about to run out. Considering how the Numidians had betrayed Lepidus, we struck a deal with them, a substantial sum of gold in exchange for trade and military access. This way, Agrippa and the Victrix Legion could march for Iberia without making our situation that much worse. Now that was only allowed to happen up in Gaul. I won't focus too much on this sphere of the conflict, but you should know we were forced to raise an additional legion up here to guard our border. As Agrippa reached Iole, the town willingly changed allegiance. Maybe it was to avoid the wrath of Numidia, or maybe the locals just knew who their true masters were, that being Octavian and the men of Rome who now marched towards Cyrene. Many of the local tribes decided to submit as well, but considering how Lepidus simply could send forward his fleet if we ever left, Agrippa was hesitant to march any further. Without a fleet to support in this war, progress was impossible. The thing is, we couldn't even divert our own navy to that cause, simply because Antony and Egypt both sailed ever closer to our sea lanes and trade routes. A confrontation was on the horizon. The cowardly Egyptians, however, refused to engage without the support of Antony. If only our subjects had the same mindset. Both of the Gallic armies were defeated, leaving our western front more vulnerable than ever. And it was about to get so much worse. Without warning, Mark Antony struck the most devastating blow, sending our entire offensive into jeopardy. His navy attacked and seized Asculum, and not only killed our men, but also exposed a glaring weakness in Octavian's defensive strategy. Without Asculum, we couldn't issue the export food edict in Latium, taking away about 10,000 gold worth of income, and thus lost our only true income source. Bankruptcy was on the horizon, and if that was to happen, men would desert over the lack of wages. Of course, we had anticipated an attack from Antony, but that was by land and in Cisalpine Gaul, not at the heart of our nation from the sea. To make this entire situation slightly more annoying, Mark Antony had coordinated the attack in the middle of winter, meaning our defensive army would struggle to react. Taxes were raised significantly, but even more controversially, Octavian decided to sack Cyrene, a city that had no say in who their overlord was, to then spend the gold on reinforcing the Cisalpine army. Just to be clear, it was necessary considering the circumstances at hand, but at the same time extremely wrong. Ariminum fell shortly thereafter at the hand of Antony, and the Egyptian armies marched to confront Octavian just days after seizing the city. Sacrifices had to be made, and thus Octavian decided, like a true leader, to sacrifice his own security by sending his fleet north to help in the Adriatic. Getting there was its own challenge entirely. Mark Antony had multiple fleets blocking our path, and bloodshed was a certainty if we wanted to restore our treasury. Formed with the sturdy center of our largest ships and the smaller fireport ships on the flanks, the ships defied both winds and waves to hammer into the hostile ships. The archers set our ships on fire, but didn't slow us down. Neptune claimed their bodies. Octavian lost no more than a single ship. As the voyage continued, we once again came into contact with the Egyptian cowards that now sought refuge near the Gulf of Corinth. For a moment, Octavian considered to test the spineless troops by taking on a force twice the size of his own, but decided against it in favor of safety behind the walls of Cyrene. Immediately after winter had passed, the Cisalpine Legion marched into Ariminum, destroying some of Antony's ships, though it was just a minor residue left behind by the main fleet that had sailed over to Illyria. Here they would be reinforced by Evocati all the way from Rome. This army would no longer be a meager border patrol. Out at sea, a third fleet attacked, but were no match for our marines, whose experience quickly increased from each fight they were in. In retaliation, as expected, Egypt initiated the siege of Cyrene. Octavian had made peace with his decision to stay, but now there was no way around it anymore. However, back in Rome, riots were tormenting the streets. In the Senate, representatives of the proletarian class expressed their outrage with Octavian's regime. Grabbing that party alone wasn't enough, and considering how they held political sway of Cisalpine since the departure of our legion stationed there, a secession seemed inevitable. To be fair, their representatives, who mainly were the ones administrating the lands of Latium, were the ones who suffered the most from Mark Antony's naval assaults. Taking back Asculum to then be able to lower our taxes again did help out to some extent, but Octavian overall had to give up a lot of political power and gravitas to sort out this mess. Expanding our naval presence for the moment seemed almost impossible. We had locked in the Egyptian fleet and called for assistance from the smaller fleet here, but now Lepidus too began making moves. His fleet was sailing dangerously far west, threatening many of our defenseless ports. The air-ground army too tried to thwart our army. But on land, we were at least somewhat capable. An advantage we simply couldn't leverage without naval superiority. The smaller fleet we called for went in to destroy the Egyptian fleet, but somehow, like a fucking cockroach, broke our blockade and escaped. I think only decimation here was in order. The smaller fleet would then sail to aid Octavian while the main corps continued north to clear the Adriatic of Antonine supporters. New ranch investments took place so we could finish what we started so long ago. Over in Iberia, there was a moment where we considered pushing deep into the country, towards Numantia, but got second thoughts after discovering how well guarded Lepidus kept his holdings. This just gave us time to focus on the Egyptian front, where they now launched their assault. However, to our luck, their cowardice led to just a single army attacking. Therefore, although Octavian's troops wasn't at full strength, he and the Prima Italica Legion repelled the Egyptians on the wall. The captives were killed, but Octavian suffered too many casualties to make a counterattack. Not without replenishment at least. The smaller fleet that now reached Cyrene, after the battle mind you, got bolstered with additional smaller ships. Although our army in Iberia wasn't at full strength, I saw an opportunity to attack ours and took it. This was only possible because many of their armies were moving elsewhere, punishing the local tribes in the west most likely. Their fleet though was still around near Ibosim, so it wasn't completely without risk. As such, considering Octavian wasn't about to march into Egypt in the near future, the small fleet once again set sail halfway across the Mediterranean to give the much needed naval support that was required to sway the balance of power over in Iberia. Likewise did Agrippa towards Tingis, as the Numidian army was stationed just outside of Iole to protect it. But more importantly, our fleet finally caught and engaged the Antonine fleet. They tried to attack us from multiple directions, forcing us to split up our numbers. Although some of their ships got destroyed in the first ramming attack, it quickly turned into a standstill. This was purely an advantage for the enemy, as they were able to bring down many of our ships that way. Inevitably though, we did bring around our other group to hit the cluster of ships from the flank, breaking down the enemy piece by piece. Many ships of our own were lost, but the immediate threat Mark Antony posed to Latium was gone. But they could still rebuild, and for that reason, we didn't just sit around. No, the Cisalpine Legion marched for Illyria. By now, Agrippa had reached Tingis and captured it through a swift and decisive attack. Lepidus was now stuck in Iberia. Once the naval reinforcements arrived, a full-on invasion would be possible. Our absence at Iole, however, was heartfelt the second the Numidians went on their merry way. Ships were clearly more important than armies at this point. Hence, we also began building a third fleet near Terras. But if we are to end the war, we obviously need to bring our two armies together if we are to stand any chance against all of these numbers here. Iole we didn't have to worry about. The pesky Numidians stole it right away and now held a firm grip over Central Africa. In time they would be annexed into our nation though through other various means. This however meant our fleet was free to roam around and assist in the conquest of eastern Iberia. Noteworthy was how the fleet single-handedly took Ibosim. No armies required to waste time on that. Once Agrippa crossed over, the fleet would participate down there as well, but by doing so leave ports vulnerable. Yes, I know, again. They would remedy this by sailing back and destroy the last fleet Lepidus had available in the Mediterranean. The seas beckoned before us.